of that momentary event into the ongoing, unfolding context, then it places much more of the emphasis on that sort of relative processing in time rather than on the absolute values. And I think that that's what's going on here. And so for that reason, if you were to transpose it to a different key, I think you'd still, a memory-evoking piece, you'd still see similar coupling. Yeah.
I also have some questions about this. So, would you expect to see maybe at least a dissociation or something of major versus minor keys, or maybe minor would cluster together in these sort of microregions, and major might cluster a little more close together, and that might seem to correspond to something that does have more of a sort of stable relation to autobiographical memories and emotions and things like that. Is that something you expect, or is that, yeah?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, one could presumably go back and all these data and look at that in those terms. I'm not sure. It's hard to predict. I mean, just to go back to tie this into sort of the emotional qualities of it, right? It's been really pretty difficult to find really clear mappings of basic emotions within the brain. I mean, within the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, I mean, there's evidence that rewarding stimuli are represented a little bit more medially, and punishers end up activating more lateral areas. But that distinction doesn't map cleanly onto a major-minor distinction, because both those things might be rewarding. And so I'm not sure whether or not one would actually see a topographical organization based on that distinction, or perhaps an interaction with the emotional quality. I think these regions shown here, there have been other meta-analyses of various tasks, and to ask what does that very rostral part of the medial prefrontal cortex do. And it's been implicated in this process called mentalizing, which is sort of this ongoing process of incorporating the stream of sensory stimuli with one's own sense of self in the moment, right? It's sort of a place of integration of external and internal worlds. And so I think there are many representations of various things that exist within this region, and so to try to get at some underlying sort of invariant topographies, if you will, is still a project.
Yeah, I think that. Can I ask a follow-up?
Please.
Then maybe it also it's conceivable, especially in such high-level brain regions, you might expect that what's being responded to is something quite complex and multidimensional, and that even if you're just talking about the musical aspects of this memory, that the different features of that music, well, there's so many different features of that music, which I think we were alluding to before. So could that possibly be related to why you see this difference across or within the same individual when they're listening to different styles?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, so the whole individual differences, literature, how that interacts with this is interesting also. I guess here, let me just offer an unsolicited comment here, but this is in relation to a recent paper by Valerie Salampour and Robert Zatori, where basically they had subjects engaged in a task. They're just deciding how much money would I be willing to spend on an iTunes track. And they literally took iTunes tracks and gave people a little budget, and they were lying in the scanner, evaluating the music. And basically within 10 seconds or so, activity in the nucleus accumbens, in the ventral striatum, part of the reward circuitry, was already making that decision, are you going to buy the piece of music, how much are you going to spend on it? But what's really interesting is that the regions, as you're doing this task, that are just being engaged, it's basically the auditory cortex, and then also the same part of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex here that I was seeing all this tonality tracking in my initial study. So it really supports this notion of you're listening to music and you're evaluating, how is this matching my current emotional states, my desires, and things like that. You're making this value judgment explicitly in this particular case, but again, you're integrating that stimulus with your own affective state, and this region is sort of critically involved in that process. Yeah?
I'm curious, at this point in all these studies, where do you think that the brain imaging and musical responses could or should go?
Thanks for the question. So, what I didn't talk about is this vast neuroimaging literature on studies that say focus more on rhythm and then see much more engagement of motor areas, premotor areas. The studies that focus on explicitly detecting expectancy violations and how are those being processed, or studies that examine, if we're shifting attention around in the auditory scene, what processes, what brain areas are responsible for that. And the take-home message is that basically what set of brain areas is being engaged really depends on the particular task that you're asking the person to do. And so, you can construct a whole variety of tasks in association with the music, and essentially find brain areas that other studies would suggest should be responsible for those tasks are now becoming engaged. And so, for me, the goal then is to say, is to try to understand these really profound experiences that we have in music. So one of the things I didn't talk about, but which was on all the advertising material for the conference, so my apologies to anybody who feels like there was a bait and switch, is studying the groove and trying to understand, this immersion in music and the urge to move with music. So a lot of what we heard from in Laurel's talk this morning, but that's a really deep, positive experience. Or, for example, studies on improvisation, there's a larger number of those. So I think those get at these really complex experiences that we have. And I just think it would be beautiful to have models, where you start with the auditory stimuli, you model that fully, right? And you have models of the behavior and models of brain function, and then are able to integrate and explain how these different brain networks are interacting in somewhat realistic brain models in order to provide an explanation for, okay, when this is happening, this is giving rise to this meaningful experiential state. So. Yeah, another lifetime.
In autobiographical memory research, there's often a tendency to elicit these participant narratives like you did. But it's also common that they'll do some sort of content coding to get the meaning of those. So I was kind of wondering if you had thought about or done this already, about looking at the way the toroidal model or tonal spaces might be able to predict the type of recalled memory content.
Yeah, I should mention that. So I have this project I'm calling the Neuro Biography project, and I'm desperately fighting with our IRB now to let me scan people across multiple sessions, within a week or so. But the idea is, I have one participant so far who provided 425 memory evoking songs, 7 different periods of her life, provided photographs and everything, and is willing to be scanned a lot. And the goal is the idea is if you get one of these subjects in there and you know the content, and she's providing, 250 to 400 word descriptions, memory descriptions for each of these songs, right? So you can do the content coding, you can sort of try to lay out the semantic space of the memory of her biography. And then the idea is in the scanner, then you do all this to get the toroidal model and try to associate that with the semantic content. Actually, and then the photographs she provided to try to triangulate, how are these things distributed in the brain. I'm hoping that it's possible approaching it in this way. Yeah, Laurel?
Well, I think most of the songs that you used have words, right?
Yeah, correct.
So what do you think the interaction is there? I suspect a lot of the autobiographical memories that people have are also associated with the words.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly the case in that slide I had with that young damsel who got dumped, right? And the song that, I don't know how closely you heard the words of the song where she, all the guys are bastards. I mean, that's basically a kick him in the balls sort of song, right? And that's what the lyrics are essentially saying. So I do think that there is strong priming also via the lyrics, and that's not something that I've dissociated here. I think that's actually an interesting point of individual differences. So I think some people are very much focused on listening to lyrics. That's a big part of it. Others couldn't care less about the lyrics. And so I think that that'll be an interesting dissociation between lyrics and instrumental music in the context of these individual differences.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. So I'm interested in the role of experience in development of these networks. Have you looked at musicians versus non-musicians? I mean, I know that you differentiate between subjects who have a lot of autobiographical memories and those who don't, for music. Those may not necessarily map along at all to what a musician and non-musician. But are there differences between these various groups?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I've just sort of taken people and not differentiated between them. I mean, I've just assumed that this is an experience that supersedes that. But I think there would be some interesting differences because I think musicians, for example, should have many more memories of being in a performance or rehearsal situation or what have you with specific pieces of music. And so then the clear prediction there is you see more engagement of motor areas and things like that for pieces that they have these strong associations with. So I think there's some clear predictions and it's stuff that needs to be done. I think we're ready for...
We're almost ready to call it a day. If someone has a very quick question, we could take it. If not, we will thank Peter for a couple of quick announcements. Dinner is going to be served in the Madeira room, which is over there. It is on the other side, and then there's going to be seating in the patio on the western side. So we'll actually see the sunset behind the mountains. After a while, the mountains are going to